This week's gospel is a really interesting story. It's one that I particularly like. And of course, it concerns the whole question of wealth and poverty, the poor and the rich. And we need to understand that in Luke's gospel, there's a lot about that. Luke is really concerned. I would say he's preoccupied about that whole question of, can you be rich and get to the kingdom, So a little bit of review. First of all, there are common concerns in the Synoptic Gospels, common stories or sayings. You can't serve God and mammon, still, I think, is the translation in the NAB. We just had that last Sunday. It's God and riches. You can't serve God and riches. How difficult it is for the rich to enter heaven, the camel in the eye of the needle thing. The poor woman who gives everything she has in the temple and she's praised. The rich young man who's only young really in Matthew, but we tend to call him young. Remember that story? It's a man who really wants to follow Jesus and he just can't quite give up on those riches. So those are common across the Synoptic Gospels, but Luke really lays it on heavy. For example, Matthew's Beatitude, first Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In chapter 6, Luke gives his rendition, blessed are you poor, for you will inherit the kingdom. And a little bit later, woe to you rich, you've already had your reward. And as I think about it, this story that we're dealing with today is kind of an illustration of that. And later on in chapter 12, the man who tries to get Jesus to settle an inheritance with his brother, and Jesus says, oh, I'm not going to do that. Luke adds to that Jesus says, life does not consist in abundance of possessions. And in chapter 14, after the common saying, unless you take up your cross, you can't be my disciple, who builds a tower unless he thinks he can finish it? Who starts a war unless you can think you can win it? And that's a rather good thing to think about these days. Just so, adds Luke, you can't be my disciple unless you renounce all your possessions. So he has these challenges that he throws at us. His is the story about Zacchaeus, the just tax collector. The tax collectors are despised and they're supposed to be rich, having gotten their wealth unjustly, depriving people they're collecting the taxes from. And Jesus goes out of his way to say, Zacchaeus, I'm going to have dinner with you tonight. And Zacchaeus says, if I defraud anybody, I repay it fourfold, So he's the exception that proves the rule here, but he is the exception. And in chapter 16, Luke hails his ultimate insult at the Pharisees. He says they are lovers of money. You have in Luke parables of compassion, like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, but we also have parables of reversal, and that's what this one is that we're looking at today. So we have three main characters. Lazarus, who's no relation to Mary and Martha here. They don't have a brother. That's in John. The rich man, who is never named, unless you are of a vintage that you remember his name as Dives, which is simply the dives, the Latin word dives, which means rich. I remember that from grade school. But in fact, he doesn't have a name. And Abraham. We all know who Abraham is. There are, in fact, two other group characters, minor characters, you might say. There are the angels who bear Lazarus to Abraham's bosom, and we'll say something about that in a minute. So Lazarus, in fact, it's like an assumption. He's carried up to, they don't use the word heaven, but that's kind of what we're thinking of here. And then there are the dogs, and the dogs lick his wounds, Lazarus's wounds, and we tend to think, oh, gross. Let's stop and think about it. Dogs lick their own wounds. They lick their babies. They lick your face if they like you. It's a way of relating. The dogs are relating to Lazarus in their own way, and the people in the rich man's house are not. So they also serve an important role there. They know what to do to help him. What's really interesting is that there's no judgment scene here. There's no sheep and goats. There's no lining them up together and assigning them to different places. It's just sort of taken for granted. Lazarus dies, doesn't say he was buried. It says he dies and he's carried to Abraham's bosom. It's like a bodily assumption. And interestingly, this word bosom, I don't know what you imagine there. The word is kolpos, K-O-L-P-O-S, which is the same word that is used in John 13:23 of the beloved disciple who does something with Jesus. And we don't usually say that he is on the bosom of Jesus. They use different words there. It's hard to translate in a way that that we can get a sense of it. Some attempts, other than bosom, most translations here say bosom, but other attempts, he's at the side of Abraham, he's embraced by Abraham. One translation says he's hugged by Abraham. So you get the idea. And whatever you want to think of how you want to translate the beloved disciple and Jesus at the Last Supper, just bear in mind, it is exactly the same word, is exactly the same expression. So it then says that the rich man dies and is buried, period. Very interesting. Lazarus is never buried, but the rich man is. And in the next scene, however, he's in torment. So he's not just lying dead in the tomb. The assumption, I think, is that the fact that he's put into the ground means that, he's going to go to this place of torment, which they use the Greek word here, Hades. It comes out of Greek religion and is this fearful underworld where nobody human living can survive. Why do they associate it with the underground? Because of thermal activity that in certain places in the Mediterranean world they see happening. So the rich man is in this place, and it is a place of torment. And as I say, there's no judgment scene. It's just Abraham patiently explains it to the man. You had good things in life, now you don't. Lazarus had bad things in life, now he has good things. It's just sort of the way it is. So let's go back for a moment to what's actually happening in life. It says that Lazarus longed to have the crumbs that fell from the table of the rich man, but no one offered them to him. It's not that he was refused, it was that he was ignored. This was somebody in need who was ignored. Probably homeless, it doesn't say that, but one could assume it. And mostly, I think often of the act of contrition and what I have done and what I have failed to do. And I really think that what I have failed to do is much bigger than the what I have done for all of us. Here's an example. The people in the rich man's house, and he, of course, is the person who could have set the example, it's what they failed to do. It's what they failed to do for Lazarus. The rich man is, in fact, failing in his patronage obligation. It is the role of the wealthy. I suppose in any society, particularly it was in this society, to look out for the needy, for the poor, to provide them shelter, to provide them food. In fact, in Roman society, it's a big thing. The elite, the wealthy are expected to do this, to provide free banquets for the needy. So it's not just exactly a tit for tat, it's what is the obligation? What is the responsibility of those who have wealth? There's one whole train of thought in biblical thinking, biblical theology, that if you are wealthy, you got it by depriving others. It's this thing that anthropologists sometimes call limited good. The idea of unlimited growth, economic growth, is simply unknown. And so there's a limit to how much people can have. And if you have more than you need, you're depriving somebody else because somebody else then should have had it and doesn't have it. There are other lines of thinking that say wealth is a blessing from God. But that doesn't seem to be the one that's operative here. What kind of gets to me with this story is that is the neglect, the not noticing, not even noticing him there. And there's something that I've learned from experience, and that is that when you're dealing with street people or dealing with people who are asking for money, you don't have to give them money, just talk to them. Just treat them as human beings. I've had a number of experiences like that. You're waiting at the red light and there's a guy and he's walking along and you keep your window up and sort of look straight ahead. Instead, try sometime just opening the window halfway and just carrying on a short conversation. I especially learned this one time when I was part of a group of people waiting for a bus. And a man came and approached each of us with his hand out, and people just sort of turned, and I just decided that's not what I was going to do. And so I looked at him and I said, "I'm sorry, I can't." You know what he said? "That's all right. Thank you for talking to me." And that is what doesn't seem to be going on between Lazarus and the rich man or anybody in his household. So we haven't talked yet about the chasm between the two places. It's so interesting. You can't go across from one to another, but you can see over there. So the rich man can see Lazarus enjoying being on the bosom of Abraham. And he, of course, is in torment. He's thirsty because it's really hot there, and asks for Lazarus to cross over. Lazarus, to whom he has never done anything good. Now he wants Lazarus to do something good for him. And it's too late. It's impossible. And Abraham patiently explains, no, the chasm is there and we can't cross over. So then he tries a new ploy. I've got 5 brothers at home. Send Lazarus to warn them. So now Lazarus should leave his comfortable place on the bosom of Abraham and go warn the brothers, which would actually mean Lazarus returning from the dead. And Abraham, of course, says, they have Moses and they have the prophets. Let them believe that. But the rich man says, no. Somebody coming back from the dead, they'll really believe that. And Abraham says, they won't even believe it if somebody comes back from the dead. At which point you think, doing, what is this parable really about? We thought it was about the wealthy and the poor and the neglect of the poor, and it certainly is. Remember that parables are multivalent. They don't just have one point. You can look at them from all kinds of different angles. And this cynical remark of Abraham, even if somebody comes back from the dead, they won't believe, kind of hits us in the face. Because, in fact, we believe that somebody did come back from the dead. And do we believe? Does anybody believe? Do we take up the message of Jesus? All of this about the treating people as persons, the neglect of our duty that we fail to do, all of that is involved here. And yet, at the end, we think, oh, it also has to do with how much do we believe? How much do people really believe? Because we do have someone who has come back from the dead.